Some artists spend their entire careers trying to escape their own greatest achievement. Paul McCartney spent decades living in the shadow of the Beatles before one song quietly reminded the world exactly who they were dealing with. The setup. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the most successful musician in the history of popular music.
Maybe I'm a mess that the way you love me all the time.
It sounds like an absurd thing to say. How could the man who wrote Yesterday and Hey Jude and Let It Be
Whisper words of wisdom, let it be,
feel anything other than complete and permanent validation? But success at that level carries its own specific weight, and by the time the Beatles dissolved in 1970, Paul McCartney was carrying more of that weight than almost anyone around him fully understood. He had been a Beatle since he was a teenager. The band had been the entire context of his adult creative life.
broken wings learn to fly all your life.
The structure within which everything he had ever made had existed and been understood. Without it, he was not just a musician without a band. He was a person without a context.
It's based on a novel by a man named Lear, and I need a job, so I want to be a paperback.
Suddenly required to exist as an individual in a world that had only ever known him as one quarter of something much larger than himself. The public breakup of the Beatles had not been kind to his reputation.
Blackbird fly into the light of a dark.
The legal disputes, the conflicting narratives about who had done what and why, the very public airing of grievances that had previously been contained within the band's private dynamics, all of it had left him in a position that felt fundamentally unfair, given his actual contribution to the group. He had been cast, at least in certain corners of the music press, as the villain of the piece, the controlling one, the commercial one, the one whose melodic gifts were somehow less serious than John Lennon's more abrasive artistic vision. The shadow. The comparison to John Lennon defined Paul McCartney's early solo career in ways that were almost impossible to escape. Lennon had released Plastic Ono Band in 1970, a raw and deliberately stripped-back album that the critical establishment immediately embraced as a work of genuine artistic courage.
Mother, you had me.
Its directness, its willingness to confront pain without melodic prettiness or commercial calculation, made it exactly the kind of record that serious music criticism was predisposed to celebrate. McCartney's debut solo album, released the same year, could not have been more different. It was intimate and homemade, recorded largely by himself at his farm in Scotland, with minimal production and a deliberate rejection of the grandeur that the Beatles had come to represent. The critical response was almost uniformly dismissive. Where Lennon's rawness was interpreted as authenticity, McCartney's simplicity was interpreted as lightweight. Where Lennon's anger was read as depth, McCartney's warmth was read as sentimentality. The double standard was considerable, and the music press applied it with a consistency that suggested something beyond mere critical disagreement. There was a narrative in place, and the narrative required McCartney to be the lesser artist. It required his melodic gifts to be the product of instinct rather than intelligence, his emotional range to be narrower and shallower than his former partners, his commercial success to be evidence of calculation rather than genuine connection with his audience. What the narrative missed, and what it would take years for the critical consensus to fully acknowledge, was that the ability to write melodies of heartbreaking beauty and emotional directness is not a lesser gift than the ability to write with anger and confrontation. It is simply a different one. And in Paul McCartney's hands, it was operating at a level that nobody else in popular music has ever quite matched. The breaking point. Wings. The band McCartney formed in 1971 with his wife Linda and guitarist Denny Laine became the vehicle through which he attempted to rebuild his public identity from the ground up. The decision to include Linda, who was not a professional musician, attracted immediate and sustained ridicule from critics who saw it as either vanity or naivety, or both simultaneously. The early Wings lineup was unstable, with members arriving and departing with a frequency that suggested organizational chaos.
Hey,
rather than deliberate artistic vision. The early albums were inconsistent, which gave the critics exactly the ammunition they had been looking for. Wildlife in 1971 was recorded in a matter of days and sounded like it.
Oh, baby, don't you let me down tomorrow.
Red Rose Speedway in 1973 had moments of genuine beauty, but lacked the cohesion of a fully realized artistic statement.
My love does it good.
The music press sharpened its collective verdict with each release. McCartney was coasting. McCartney was repeating himself. McCartney had never been the real creative force behind the Beatles and Wings was the proof. What made this period genuinely difficult was not the critical hostility itself, but the suspicion, which McCartney has acknowledged in various interviews over the years, that some of it might be right. Not about the talent, which he never seriously doubted, but about the direction. Wings felt uncertain in its early years in a way that the Beatles never had, and that uncertainty communicated itself through the music in ways that even his most devoted fans found difficult to ignore. The breakthrough came with Band on the Run in 1973. Recorded under genuinely difficult circumstances in Lagos after half the band quit days before the sessions were due to begin. The album was a critical and commercial triumph that silenced some of the doubters and reminded the world what McCartney was capable of when everything aligned. But the song that truly settled the argument had actually been written 3 years earlier, before Wings even existed, in the first few weeks after the Beatles fell apart. If this story is giving you chills, hit like and subscribe. The best part is still coming. The song, Maybe I'm Amazed, was written in early 1970, in the immediate aftermath of the Beatles' dissolution, and it carries the emotional weight of that specific moment in every single note.
Well, maybe I'm amazed at the way I really need you.
McCartney has described writing it for Linda, the woman who had stayed beside him through the most painful and disorienting period of his professional life, and that origin is completely audible in the finished recording. This is not a song constructed from craft and calculation. It is a song that arrived from genuine need, from a man who wanted to say something true about the person who had kept him together when everything else was falling apart. The structure of the song is deceptively sophisticated for something that feels so immediate and so emotionally direct. It opens with a piano chord that lands with a weight completely disproportionate to its simplicity, immediately establishing that what follows is going to matter. The vocal enters almost conversationally, building gradually through the verse before the chorus hits with a force that catches you off guard even on repeated listens. Maybe I'm amazed at the way you love me all the time. The lyric is plain to the point of being almost plain. The melody underneath it is anything but. The guitar solo that McCartney plays in the bridge is one of the most underrated moments in his entire catalog. It is not technically demanding by the standards of the era's guitar heroes, but it is perfectly constructed, saying exactly what the song needs it to say, and then stopping at precisely the right moment without overstaying its welcome by a single note. That kind of editorial precision is a form of genius that does not always get the recognition it deserves, because it operates by leaving things out rather than putting things in. The performance. The studio version of Maybe I'm Amazed, released on McCartney's debut solo album in 1970, was remarkable.
Maybe I'm amazed at the way you love me all the time.
But not immediately recognized as the landmark it would eventually become. It was not released as a single at the time, which meant it reached a smaller initial audience than it deserved, and the critical dismissal of the album as a whole meant that even sympathetic listeners sometimes overlooked it among the more modest surrounding material. What transformed the song's reputation was the live version recorded during the Wings Over America tour in 1976 and released as a single the following year. The live recording did something that the studio version had approached but never quite achieved. It made the song enormous. The band arrangement expanded the piano ballad into something that filled arenas without losing any of its emotional intimacy, which is one of the hardest things in music to actually accomplish and one of the clearest indicators of a truly great song. McCartney's vocal on the live version is among the finest performances of his career. He had always been a technically accomplished singer.
And baby, I'm amazed with you.
But live, in front of an audience of tens of thousands of people, something in his voice opened up in a way that studio recording never fully captured. The rawness that the critics had always credited exclusively to Lennon was suddenly audible in McCartney too, just expressed differently, through melody and yearning, rather than anger and confrontation. The reception, the critical reassessment of Maybe I'm Amazed, happened slowly and then all at once, in the way that most important critical reassessments do. Individual voices began acknowledging what the song actually was, a genuine rock ballad of the highest order, one that combined melodic sophistication with emotional directness in a way that very few songs in any era had managed. Those individual voices gradually became a consensus that the original dismissal of McCartney's solo work had been shaped more by the politics of the Beatles' breakup than by any honest engagement with the music itself. The live singles commercial performance in 1977 provided the kind of evidence that critical reassessment alone cannot manufacture. Real people buying a record with their own money, making a choice about what they wanted to listen to. The song connected across demographics and across the divide between casual pop listeners and serious rock fans in a way that suggested it was operating on a level beyond genre or era. Rolling Stone magazine, which had been among the most consistent champions of the narrative that positioned Lennon as the serious artist and McCartney as the commercial one, gradually began publishing pieces that questioned that framing with increasing directness. The song kept appearing on lists, kept being cited by younger artists as a defining influence, kept finding new listeners who came to it without the baggage of the Beatles' breakup and heard it simply as what it was, one of the greatest rock ballads ever written. The legacy. Paul McCartney has now been making music professionally for over 60 years, which is a fact so extraordinary that it has become almost impossible to fully absorb. He has sold more records than almost any artist in the history of popular music. He has written songs that have been recorded by thousands of other artists across every conceivable genre. He was a Beatle, which alone would have secured his place in the history of popular culture permanently and beyond any possible argument. And yet Maybe I'm Amazed remains, for many serious listeners, the single piece of evidence that settles every remaining question about who Paul McCartney actually is as an artist. Not as a Beatle, not as a commercial force, not as a cultural institution, but as a musician sitting alone with a feeling he needed to express, and the gift to express it in a way that reached across every distance between himself and his audience. What the song established permanently was something that the critical narrative of the early 1970s had tried hard to deny. That melody is not the enemy of depth. That emotional warmth is not the enemy of artistic seriousness. That a man who writes songs about love with the kind of melodic genius that McCartney possesses is not operating at a lower level than a man who writes songs about pain and anger. He is operating at a different level, one that requires its own specific kind of courage and its own specific kind of genius. Lennon himself acknowledged it. In various interviews over the years, he cited Maybe I'm Amazed as one of the finest songs McCartney had ever written, which, coming from the person the critical establishment had consistently positioned as his artistic superior, was about as complete a vindication as the song could have received. Some arguments do not need to be won loudly. Sometimes the music just has to keep playing until everyone in the room finally hears what was always there. Paul McCartney never stopped believing in the power of a great melody to say something true and lasting about the human experience. Maybe I'm Amazed was his proof, his declaration, and his finest hour as a solo artist. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell us your favorite McCartney moment in the comments below. We will see you in the next one.